All right, good morning, everyone. It is such a joy to be back together again to learn from our master storyteller, our Magid in residence, who has come to teach us again this morning thanks to the generosity of brotherhood and sisterhood and our adult ed committee. So without further ado, Rick Stone.
Thank you. I've got a mic here. Let's see here. How are we doing? You can hear me? I can hear me? Good. I'll stick this in my back pocket, and we're in good shape. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Feels weird to be back in this room in a very different capacity from last night. So today's not a presentation, it's a workshop. And you can see there's some materials on your tables. And you need to be at least with one other person. I think we've got 3 and 2 here. And we have some tables with maybe too many people, but it's okay. And what I want to do is share with you some fundamental tools that can really be useful in your relationship with yourself, with your children, and your grandchildren. So I thought I would start with a story. It's a true story. A number of years ago, when I first got involved with storytelling, I was teaching at the community college in Orlando. And I had a young student who seemed lost. He didn't have a sense of his life. And in talking with him after class a couple times, I discovered he came from a divorced family. His father was not present in his life. I think his mother had to work 2 jobs to kind of maintain and keep them together. He knew nothing of his history. He knew nothing of his people. And his first name was Alexander. And his last name was an Irish name. So I said, I want you to go and see if you can find out where your people come from. And see what you can learn about your name. So he went off to do research. And when he came back the next week, he was a transformed person. He was holding himself differently. And so I said, what did you learn? He said, well, first of all, he learned his people came from such and such a town in Ireland, and there was a history there, and he had delved into the history, and he learned all kinds of things about that. And then he researched his namesake, Alexander the Great, and found out that he was named after someone who accomplished a few things in the world. It changed the way he saw himself. So, Lador Vador, we have an opportunity with our families, the generations, is to pass on something that often young people desperately need. But I think we also need it. So that's what today's program is about. It's about giving you some ways of thinking about it, some new tools, and some new perspectives. You guys know who I am, but I've been mucking around with story for a long time. And you'll see on your table, there's a little card that says the Central Fire. And this is a new thing I'm getting ready to launch. You can use the URL code, or you can go there. But the idea is that we do not have places in our life, in our world, where we can get together to share stories. And it even shows up architecturally. It used to be all the houses had, porches on the front of the house, right? And now what do? They put them on the back of the house. So we don't create venues that are inviting for us to have neighbors come by just to talk. And, used to you could stop in and you had a potbelly stove in the winter, everyone would gather around, there would be maybe a little store or something, and you'd find all the people there and they're telling stories. And I think that we desperately need to be able to tell stories in our lives. So I mentioned this yesterday's morning program, and some of you were here yesterday, so I'll repeat it. But if you were not well, and you were not feeling right with yourself, and you went to the shaman for healing, in your community in an indigenous world. And this comes from Angeles Arian, who was an anthropologist, no longer with us. May her memory be for a blessing. She was a remarkable both kind of researcher but also writer. She said the shaman would ask you one of 4 questions. When did you stop singing? Singing. When did you stop dancing? When did you stop taking time to be quiet, either meditating or being in nature and just being present? And when did you stop taking time to be enchanted by listening to and telling stories? So how many of you know a lot of the history of your families? Raise of hands. A fair number of you. That's really wonderful. Yeah. How many of you sit around and tell stories still today with your families?
What does it mean to know much?
Say that again?
What does it mean to know much about family?
Well, do you know where your parents were born? Do you know where your grandparents were born? Do you know what they did? And maybe if they came from the old country, how did they get here? And what kinds of challenges did they have? Yeah. So it goes the gamut from between all the good stuff and all the great stuff, and also all the maybe really hard things that they had to go through to be here. So this is where we're going to be spending time today, is on the question of enchantment, and so there's a problem we have. So I've got these here. Let me get through them. There's a problem we have, and I brought this up yesterday. I coined a term a number of years ago. I called it destorification. It's kind of like deforestation. And, if you go and you cut all the trees down in a forest, and you plant nice, neat rows of pine trees, they're farming trees now, the rich ecology that was there doesn't return. And there's some really interesting stuff being written now about the mother tree in forests. There's often a tree that has a relationship with all the other trees. And if a tree is sick, trees will send nutrients underground to help that tree. They're communicating. There is something going on that's not even within our sight that is now remarkable. And I think the same is true with story, is that when we're not creating a culture of story sharing, something gets lost profoundly. And some of it can be described, and some of it is underground, some of it is at a soul level. And we are impoverished, and our children are impoverished by that. So that's a lot of the work we'll be doing today. So I talked yesterday about the power to transport, and I love this little quote from Jonathan Gottschall. We are as a species addicted to story. Even when the body goes to sleep, the mind stays up all night telling itself stories. We can't help ourselves. Our brains are wired for this stuff. And if you begin to understand the wiring of the human brain, and we'll do a little work with this morning with an exercise, is that our brains are actually powerful simulation machines for simulating not just the past, but also for imagining the future. So the other thing is that we have this is a concept that I like a lot, is that we have narrative assets. So each of you has a whole body of assets, which are your history, your experiences, the things you've learned, the things that you've faced in life. And that these assets are really essential for your health and the health of your family. And actually, and we don't have time today, I do a lot of work with organizations. I tell organizations, you have narrative assets. It doesn't show up on the ledger sheet. It doesn't show up in the annual report. But an organization, what holds an organization together are its stories. And all of you who have been in the work world at some time in your life, the first thing that happens when you go to work someplace, someone pulls you aside and says, hey, let me tell you what's going to, you got to watch out for that guy over there. He's trouble. Yeah, that guy. Yeah, that guy is smirking over there. he's a problem, and she can be a great ally to you, a great ally, and this guy over here, he's the carrier of the stories, If you want to find out anything that goes on here that's been around, he's been around a long time, he can tell you what goes, This is how we get oriented. There might be a formal orientation, but the way you really get oriented is that informal thing that happens over a cup of coffee or at the water cooler or whatever. It's a challenge today where people are now working solo at home. How do you build a culture, a shared culture of stories where people feel like they're part of something? But we're going to work on our family stuff today. So, telling our family stories turns out to be something that's really crucial for children in a remarkable way. And I mentioned this work yesterday, is that my colleagues in the Devar, my colleagues at Emory, Robin Feibush and Marshall Duke, they've been studying intergenerational storytelling for 30 years. And they actually sort of it was by happenstance that they got into that, and then they sort of got more and more interested in it and more interested in it. And they started looking at what happens about how stories are passed on. And it's not like sitting around formally, like we're going to have story time here in the house. It's over the kitchen table. It's in the kitchen while you're preparing food and your daughter's there, and you're just sort of saying things. And someone mentioned yesterday, said, well, kids aren't listening, aren't interested in our stories any longer. And I said, oh, yes, they are. It doesn't look like they're listening, but they are listening. And the next thing you know, 20 years later, they go, and I think you're mentioning your kids. You've been telling stories of Terry, of your father. And the next thing you know, they're completing the stories. And you may not even thought that they were necessarily hearing you at the time, but they are hearing you. And those stories are finding a way into their consciousness and into the background. So it turns out that knowing your family's stories is one of the most important things for them to develop resilience and self-esteem. And in fact, they found there was no better predictor of children having high resilience and self-esteem than knowing their family stories. No better predictor. So you have on your table here this little questionnaire. It's called the Do You Know scale. Grab it right now and let's just take a minute. And it's a yes and no. And let me tell you about this. There are proxy questions. These questions in themselves are not necessarily that important, but they're proxies for other kinds of knowledge you might have about your family. So let's just take a minute, and you should have some pencils there at the table, and see how many yeses you know with regard to. We have more here. Do you need some more? You need one more, please, Terry, if you could. I think we need another one here. If you need one, raise your hand and we'll get you. Okay. So I know that some people are still adding up. Who's got at least 10 yeses? Let's see a show of hands. 10 yeses. Anybody? How about 12 yeses? At least 12. How about 15? Hands. Okay, 17 yeses. Okay, okay. Anybody have 18? Oh, a couple more. 19? Oh my goodness. 20? Oh my good. Okay, yeah. All right, you're excused. You don't need it. So take this home if you want. You can go to my website, storyintelligence.com. And you can download this. It's available for download. Give it to your kids and grandkids. It'll be interesting to see, do they know stories about your family? As I said, these are proxy questions. Knowing where your parents went to school is not necessarily the most important thing. But if you know that, you probably know a lot of other stuff. Okay? Excuse me. So this becomes, I think, a crucial tool in understanding how important it is for you to be sharing your stories with your families and with your kids and grandkids. And it gives them, if you go back to the opening story about my student Alexander, once you know these stories, it changes things. And if you think about our tradition, which I talked in the Devar a little yesterday, is that what's Torah? We have this enumeration of all these generations, and so begat so-and-so, and so lived so many years, and this person did that. And I don't think this was a genealogical exercise which they were just interested in kind of mapping out all these people. I think what Torah really is a series of intergenerational tales of triumph and difficulty and challenges, and they're all the kinds of stuff that we human beings in the 21st century still confront. And when a child is born into a family, they don't have stories. Now, I don't think we're tabula rasa necessarily. I think we do come in with a lot. But we don't come in with stories. And so we don't have a body of stories to draw on. So when we face a difficulty, we don't have a story. You go, I got through that over here. This is kind of like that. I think I can get through this over here. We don't have that. But if we have our family stories, our parents' stories, and our grandparents' stories, we have that as a resource to draw on. And someone yesterday in the Talmud class asked the question, we were talking about, when terrible things happen. And she brought up it was a nephew who had committed suicide, which was just, the most horrific of things that can happen in a family. I would suggest is that young people who make that choice is because they don't have a story to draw upon. They can tell them, I could get through this. So they confront something, and it feels like they're in a narrow alley with no way of turning around and no way out. And the only way out is to check out. But if they have a story, that can even help them through. Elizabeth and I have a friend who was struggling with cancer. Unfortunately, he died recently. His father and his mother, they were freedom fighters during the war. They escaped and they fought the Nazis in the forests. And one of the things over dinner when he was visiting Atlanta with us, he said, I sometimes think back on my father and what he went through, and my mother, what she went through, and I thought, cancer's nothing compared to that. And so for him, that story was an empowering story to help him face a challenge that he was facing. So we'll do a little more work with this as we go along this morning. So let's try a little exercise, and I want you to do this with a partner. If you've got a threesome, I know there are no odd people in here, but we may have some odd numbers. Steve guaranteed me there were no odd people here in the synagogue, except for Marty. Yeah. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to complete this phrase. I come from a people who, and from them I learned. And I want you, there are probably infinite number of ways you can answer this, but you can answer it very broadly. I come from the Jewish people, or my people, who faced all kinds of challenges in the Pale, and my grandmother took a train by herself at age 13, and my grandfather stole, this is a true story, my grandfather stole his brother's ticket at age 13 to come to America. Okay, so I come from a long line of thieves, but he did bring his brother over. That's the good news. That's a longer story. So you can answer very broadly, and from them I learned that I could start over again. Okay. You could answer more focused in terms of your family. I come from a family. I'd say I come from a family that has a sense of humor. Not always nice humor sometimes, a little cynical and sarcastic, but we have a sense of humor. And so we're able to laugh at almost anything. And I shared in the Devar yesterday this story of buying a casket for my mother. And even in the midst of that awful situation, and we're confronted with this complete absurdity of whether to buy one for $26.95 or one for $22.95, and the difference was between pine dowels and oak dowels. And when that was revealed to my brother and I, we were on the ground almost laughing because of the absurdity. And the poor funeral director was like, just horrified, And so we even found ways to find humor even in some pretty serious, difficult times. So get with a partner. We'll just take about a minute or two each, and we'll come back and see and harvest what we can learn. So I come from a people who, and from them I learned. So try to do twosomes or threesome if you have to. Okay, let me get you back.
They're willing to do stories now. It's going to be hard.
It's hard. Once you turn that key on and the engine goes, I could just sneak out, and about an hour and a half later they go, "Where is he?" Okay, let me get you back if I could. Please, let's. So, did anybody have an insight about themselves, perhaps, that they hadn't ever thought about before? Anybody have a kind of a revelation that they hadn't considered before about themselves? Okay, none? Okay. Yeah, would you be willing? So you put a couple things together that maybe you never saw that were linked together. Okay.
And considering that as well, that's a reality that I should appreciate as opposed to just have these disparate facts.
Oh, so it's something you had not appreciated before until we did this. Okay, beautiful, beautiful. Anybody share with somebody that they knew previously and maybe learned something about them that they didn't know about them? Yeah. What did you learn?
Well, I learned a lot about Steve's family, which I didn't realize that his mom was from Virginia, West Virginia. Oh my God. I was curious to him, how did she end up in West Virginia? And he doesn't know. But curious, that how does a Jew get to America and end up in West Virginia? Probably maybe some of the salesman family. But in any event, I thought that was interesting to learn that.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Anybody else have a kind of an interesting aha or revelation in thinking about or hearing from someone else's story? Mm-hmm.
I think that some of the things that were shared were also my story. Some of the values that were shared were things that are also important to me. That's not what I said when I repeat. I wasn't going to repeat, but education and drive.
So you found similarities. Yeah. Did other people find that there was a lot of similarity between their experience and their partner's experiences? Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I found that there's a kind of myth about family that grows up and that gets enhanced, but when you really probe these questions, things might be not exactly as they are passed on. So there's this narrative creep.
You calling me a creep? No. Yeah. So 1 second. Let me. So this is really interesting about the mythology of a family, the stories that evolve, and just like Uncle Jake, who always starts telling the fish story, and every year it gets a little bigger. Our narratives in our family stories also sort of take on a life about who we are as a family, and certain stories become prominent in reinforcing that and telling that story, and sometimes they're not necessarily true, or they have been shifted and changed, but they do give people a sense of relevance or a sense of coherence about what it means to be a part of this family. Yeah, we'll come. Go ahead.
There's a counter to that I want to share, and that is that my family did an interview with my bubby, with my grandmother in the mid '80s. We have hours of a video recording of her, And my uncle, the only survivor of that generation, transcribed it a few years ago. And he was born in the United States. My bubby was from the old country. And he proclaimed that half the things she said were bubby mices. He had never heard of these. But my point of the story is in the last 2 years, I've done a deep dive into family genealogy. And it turns out that most of those were true. He didn't know about them.
He didn't know about them. Yeah, so isn't that fascinating? So you had a comment. Yes, please. Let's see if we can reach over there. Yeah.
Many years ago, I taught school in rural West Virginia, which West Virginia reminded me. And all my students had a last name of either Fowler or Hill, and they were often related to each other. And I was impressed. They asked me, in Massachusetts, what are the two most common family names? And I said, Tillinger, my name, and Kennedy's. But it impressed me that they thought to ask.
Even that they expected that if it's true here, it should be true everywhere, right? Right. Yeah. One more here.
One quick question to throw out there. I notice when I think about stories from my childhood, and they can be quite vivid and sort of images, my sister often claims that those were her stories. And we can't tell who's...
Is the mic on? No, the mic's not on. It says it's on. Do you have it on back there?
Oh, sorry. When I think about the stories from my childhood, events that happened to me, and they can be very powerful images, sometimes like photographic images, and I relate them to my family, my sister often says, that didn't happen to you, that happened to me. I'm wondering if anyone has the sort of shared memories where it's a family memory and nobody even knows who in the family it really happened to. But
can people relate to that? Yeah. So here's an interesting thing about memory. We could spend a whole day on that, all right? But how many of you had the experience where you got together with siblings and you're telling a story about something that happened and they go, whoa, Dad never did that. I don't know where you were, but I was there, yeah. Or Mom never did that, yeah. Yeah.
My sister swears we grew up in different households.
Yeah, that's right. We grew up, yeah. You must have been like a foster kid who was brought in or something, yeah.
So when my mother died, the rabbi came and met with me and my sister and said, tell us about your mother. And there was like two different people that we would describe. And we continue to talk about this to this day. I mean, she's only 3 years younger than I am. But,
she had a remarkably different experience.
Very different experience. And so that vision of that person, of our mother, was like two different people. Yeah. Two wonderful people, but two very different ones.
Very different experiences. So I would say that we often think that experience is perceptual, but it's actually interpretive. And so if something is really relevant to me and something happens, I pay attention to that. But if it's not relevant to you, 2 years later you go, what are you talking about? I was there, that didn't happen. And we know from the work on memory is that memory is very malleable and we're very suggestible. And we know that, even with eyewitness kinds of accounts, and we find that there's great disparity in those accounts. There's a study I cite in the book in which there was an event in the underground in London, and they were searching for some terrorist. And so what happened is they came in, and there was somebody seated there who looked like he was maybe from Pakistan or something. And what's that, Elizabeth? What? Standing in front of people. Okay, sorry. My wife is my... she's assuring that I'm not talking. And he was shot. And then they did afterwards, they're trying to decide what happened. It turned out he wasn't the terrorist. Some of the people who were the police said, he came at us with a gun, and other people said he never got out of his seat. And of course, they didn't find a gun. And there were there were like 30 or 40 people on the platform there. They each had a different story about what occurred, even though they were there in that very moment. all the same, but they were all seeing it from a different point of view, and they were all bringing their own life experience to that event. And we bring our life experiences to every moment, and we have filters, and we're interpreting things, and things that are relevant, we pay attention, and other people have different filters. And so that becomes a difficult thing about how do we have a shared story? How do we have a shared story? So let's try another experiment. And how many of you consider yourself to be storytellers? Let's just see. We've got a few hands. Okay, well, this is the money back guarantee for the weekend. It's all riding on this, guys. So I promise you, by the end of this exercise, all of you will very vigorously raise your hands. And if anyone stops you in the hallways here at Temple Emmanuel and said, hey, are you a storyteller? Absolutely. And we'll be giving certificates after the class. So that, if you have to, you can carry. We'll give you a small card you can carry in your purse or wallet. So let's do this. Let's maybe get comfortable. Put your pencils down for a moment. And if you're willing, just sit back and relax. And if you're willing, close your eyes for a moment. I want to take you on a quick journey. And I want you to imagine in your mind's eye the light from a fire. It could be like the fire pit you saw on the screen. It could be a hearth in a home. It could be a candle lit. And I want you to use that light as a guide back in your memory to an earlier time when something happened with fire. Now, if you can't recall an experience with fire, think back on an earlier time when something happened with water. And what you'll discover is you'll remember that experience mostly in pictures. So I want you to imagine you've got a movie camera in your head, and I want you to make a movie of that experience from the very beginning to the very end. So just take a moment to do that. Once you're done making the movie, you can turn off the camera, and when you're ready, you can open your eyes. If anyone is snoring next to you, give them a slight nudge. I don't think we've lost anybody. So if you haven't opened your eyes, do so, please. Okay. So here's what I want to do. I want you to briefly share with a partner what you recalled. And I want to give you some directions for how to do that. So if it's your turn to share, I want you to imagine that you have a movie screen in your mind. And I want you to imagine you're going to take the movie you just made and you're going to reproject it right there on the screen of your mind. And so in a sense, when you're sharing, you have to have two pairs of eyes. One pair of eyes looking in, and the other pair of eyes making connection with your sharing partner. Now, if you're listening, I want you to listen in a very particular way. In our culture, and probably, I could say even specifically Jewish culture, once someone starts telling someone about something an experience, they go, oh, that reminds me when I was a kid, and the next thing you know, I've hijacked the story, and I'm running down the road, and I don't know if it's true for you and your family, I never ever complete a story because I'm always getting cut off, and people are just running off and telling their story. Okay? We do that a lot. So what I want to invite you to do is just listen with 100% of your attention. Don't contribute anything. Notice when you get reminded. And what we'll do is, after we've come back after the sharing, we're going to debrief this and see what we can learn about how story works in our brains and why it is so powerful. And we'll see what happens when we get reminded of things. We'll look at that. So we're going to take about, in the movie biz, this is not a feature-length film we're getting ready to do. These are shorts, 2 minutes each, and I'll give you the heads up. So be sure you get with just one other person if you have to do a threesome. So we'll do 2.5 minutes. Everybody's got a chance to share. And so, and maybe you guys, if you're with your spouse, get with somebody else. Get up and find another partner at another table. And so, everybody got the directions? All right, go. No, either or. Either or. Fire or water. Let me get you back, please. So, was everyone able to recall an experience and share it? Yeah? Well, by the authority vested in me by Temple Emmanuel and the Storywork Institute, my organization, I now pronounce all of you to be storytellers. So now we got that out of the way. But the truth is, what you just participated in is really at the heart of all storytelling. So last night, those of you who were at the performance, I don't memorize my stories. Steve and I were talking. He said, how do you remember all that? I said, I don't memorize it. What I have is a series of pictures in my mind, a movie playing in my mind that I'm watching, and all I'm doing is I'm describing it to you, the audience, as I am telling the story. So every time I tell it, it's fresh and anew. So it's not like a scripted performance on stage with theater. You know, if I drop a line, I'm not lost because I still have the pictures in my mind. I can find myself where I am in the story. I don't have someone sitting off stage right who goes, the next line is. I would be in trouble. So did everyone see it as pictures in their mind? How many had other senses involved? Maybe smell or hearing or taste? Yeah. Okay. Maybe touch. Right. Okay. So it turns out that the memory is laid down mostly in sense data. In sense data. Pictures. Smells. Tastes. Okay? How many of you have told something that maybe happened a long time ago? How many of you felt like you were there right here in this moment as you were telling it? Yeah. So it turns out that the body does not know the difference between a real event and an imagined one. Okay, and those of you who are, I'm sure we have a few people in medicine here, given the town we're in, and we know a lot from psychoimmunology, is that you can affect bodily functions by mental imagery. And you've got the placebo effect, yeah. But we can make ourselves sick with worry. And what is worry? It's imagining something bad that is going to happen. And if you keep playing that movie in your head, it will change your physiology. You can also make yourself well by playing positive imagery. And I'll tell you a little bit in a few minutes about that. So, yes? We have a microphone here, and I'll just walk it down to you real quick.
Thank you. Does the microphone smooth out her accent?
Yes, it makes all accents New England.
You might have already said this, maybe you spoke about this last night. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be there, but I think that there is an incredible power in storytelling of getting to know people.
Yes.
And to learn about each other. I mean, we are total strangers. And we've just had 2 very short conversations, and I think we've learned so much about each other in such a short time. And so I think that, the depth of that is quite incredible and healing and connect, of course,
Connecting.
Yes, totally.
Yeah. So often when I do this exercise with a bunch of strangers in the room, and I ask afterwards, I say, how many of you are going to go out to dinner together tonight? And a lot of you make best friends. And now if I had said, I want you to share the most intimate thing in your life with your partners, all of you would have been making your way to the door. You would have been out of here. I said, share a story about fire or water. It's in some ways an innocuous kind of thing. And yet just the sharing of something, a memory, suddenly makes you feel like the person sitting next to you is not a stranger any longer. So what's interesting about this is that Apple has not come out with the ear modem yet, that I can take a modem and stick it in my ear and then stick it in Steve's ear and transfer a memory. So what do? I have these pictures in my mind, I have these senses, I've got smells. What do? I have to translate that into language. And so I begin telling a story. Yes, Rabbi?
Could you talk about the difference between sharing vulnerability and sharing all your successes? Like the difference on the listener of, let me tell you about this success, that professional success, that professional success, this educational. I'm so happy, my kids are so happy, everybody's so perfect, everything is going great.
Like you want to vomit, right? Yeah.
Versus sharing vulnerability at the times things didn't work out. And you talked about why is it that vulnerability is so powerful?
Because I think that former story, which is all my successes, is almost a cultural habit we have. It's like our business card. We want to put our best foot forward kind of thing, and this is who I am and all of that stuff. And there's a lot of ego in that also. And I don't know what it is about us, but I feel repelled by that often. It feels like I feel like, okay, all right. Whereas when we're telling something about an experience we've had, there's something authentic in it. We're being authentically real. Whereas the other is a kind of a cultural, communal, societal story, which is in some ways quite superficial, So I think but even telling stuff, let me tell you about a time I almost burned the kitchen down. Oh my gosh. Well, one, I can relate to that. I may not be able to relate to all your successes unless I'm somebody also very successful. And my wife tells this funny story about her father when he was out raising money for Jewish causes. What he would do is he would go and he'd raise a fair amount of money, but he wouldn't go to the biggest macher in town yet. He would wait, and he would go to he'd work his way up, and he would go to the biggest macher and he said, "Listen, Schwartz down the street, he's given $100,000, and the big macher, I'm not going to let Schwartz outdo me. I'll give 150, okay?" And so there is that level of ego that I think gets into our relationships that is present in that first story, which isn't, the truth is when you pull all that stuff away, we're just human beings. And the other story, the story about fire or water, or the story about a time where you had a difficulty, suddenly you're being, I think, much more present and more human, I think. Yeah. So we translate these pictures into words, and we tell a story. Once upon a time, and I have one scientific slide because I know that we're in Boston and there's a lot of highly educated people here, and I was told that I had to have something scientific here. So this is my scientific slide for the day. But this does a pretty good job of explaining what just happened. So our friend here is recalling a time when the barn burned down, and he's seeing it vividly in his mind's eye. Maybe he's even hearing the horses neighing and the cows mooing and the chickens clucking, and all the sensations and feelings of that come rushing back. He feels like he's just there, like it just happened. And he has to tell it in words. When I was a young man, I remember the time the barn burned down. What's interesting is that if he's telling that story, and you grew up someplace, I don't know, maybe in Indiana where the barns are painted red, and you would see a red barn because that's in your experience base. But if you grew up in Tennessee where the barns are left bare wood, and someone says, I remember the time when the barn burned down, you're going to see a bare wood barn in your mind's eye. Unless he said the red barn burned down, right? Okay? Now, our friend here is listening. How many of you, as you were listening to your partner tell their stories, did you see it as pictures in your mind? The mind does a very interesting thing. It takes the language of the story, and what do we do? What does the brain do? It immediately translates it back into pictures, into sense data, and maybe other senses. Now, she's not quite seeing it the way he is, okay? How many of you, as you were listening, did you feel like you were almost there as you were hearing the story from your partner? Yeah. So what stories do is they allow us literally and figuratively to walk in the shoes of another person. We can suddenly live inside their experience and be there with them. And I think that's maybe also the distinction. In the story of all the success and stuff, there's nothing there for me to enter into. But when you tell me a story about something real, Now I can empathize with that. I can get into it. Now, she's seeing it differently. So, I talked a little yesterday about Paula Underwood, my Native American teacher. And she says, we're 100% responsible for everything we say, but we're only 50% responsible for what other people hear. Because they're going to add their 2 cents. They're going to bring their experiences into the listening. So we don't listen in an accurate way. We listen creatively. So as we're hearing the story, we're recreating the story in our imagination. So we become co-creators with the teller. So when the rabbi is telling a story from Talmud or telling a story from Torah, what are we doing as listeners? We're co-creating the story in our imaginations, but in our own unique way. In our own unique way. And it's individualized. And we're seeing ourselves. We're walking with David. We're walking with Moses in his journey across the desert with all these unruly Jews who are difficult to corral. We are there with him. And that's the power of story. That's the power of story. Now, as I said, she sees it a little differently. How many of you were reminded of things in your own experience as you were listening? They sort of popped off in their mind. Yeah. So story acts like fuses in our imagination to connect us with things that we already know. And that's why it's so powerful as a learning tool, is that as we're listening, we're saying, oh, that's sort of like this, and that's sort of like that. And the next thing you know, we're making new neural connections. And new kinds of understanding can emerge because we're connecting dots that we had never connected before. Any questions or comments about that before we move on? Yeah.
Well, it seems like your stories that you hear, they need to have some relationship with you. So if a story is too big a jump, like if it's from another culture, if a story is from another culture, how do you, is that more difficult to
Well, yes and no. So I would say that when we read a story about someone from a whole different culture, a whole different world that's foreign to us, we're entering into the world. The story, if it's well written or well told, even though it's not part of our experience set, we can go along with the author. There is the willing suspension of disbelief that we talk about with story. So even then, and there's actually research that shows that reading stories about people who are totally different from you helps build empathy for them. And actually can reduce barriers and actually help us see people that we saw as strangers as somehow more like us. Because I think there's something, even though cultures are very unique and distinct and often very different, there is something fundamental and universal in the human dilemma, the human condition. And they show up in every culture in different ways. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you just touch on briefly the difference between...
It's on, I think, but...
Hello? Testing.
No, now there is. Yeah, it went off.
Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. The difference between us when we read a story versus when we see a story visually in...
Film.
Okay.
So there's some real distinctions between oral stories, written stories, cinematic stories. How many have read a novel and then they go and see the movie and it's not very satisfying? It's almost a universal experience. Why?
You have a mental image.
You've already co-created the story in your mind. You have developed images of who these characters are and how they interact and all those things. And what are you seeing on the screen? You're seeing someone's interpretation, someone else's story of how those characters interacted. Plus, boiling a 700-page novel down to an hour and a half in a film, a lot has got to be cut out. And so you can't get it all in there, otherwise you'd have a 15 or 20-hour film. So that's a big distinction. And there's also a distinction between oral storytelling and reading a book. So reading a book, it's between you and the author, and they're the words on the page. But now, as an oral storyteller, I have other things available to me that the author doesn't have. He has to put everything in the words. Whereas as I'm telling the story, I can get animated. I can go slow as I'm talking. I can do all kinds of things with my body and my facial expressions. And so much is conveyed through that that's not conveyed in the words coming out of my mouth.
And how do we differentiate learning, though? Do you learn better visually?
Well, one of the things that you're getting into a bigger topic. So one of the things, though, I would say is that story is the food. It has all the food groups. It's got the visual, it's got the auditory, and you feel like you're there. It has the proprioceptive stuff going on, so that there's something that story brings that is totally encompassing. So if you're a visual learner, you'll be seeing lots of pictures. If you're more an auditory learner, you'll be kind of keying on the words more than necessarily the pictures. If you're kind of, and the interesting about story is that when we're in the story, the character's running down the road and he's being chased by wild elephants. Our body feels like we're running down the road, even though we're sitting still in a chair. And something gets turned off and when we're watching the film. If we were really related to a story, and Mel Gibson's coming at you with his sword, you'd be jumping out of your seat and pulling your sword out and running toward the screen, but you just sit there, So there's something interesting, and we don't have time to go into that either, but one more and then we're going to move on.
I had a friend, he always used to call me a friend.
I think it's on. No, it's got a red light on it now, David. So go ahead and speak up and we'll just...
Anyway, he was professor of sociology in BU.
Yeah?
His name was Peter Berger, and he was world known. And one time they asked Dr. Berger, how come you never use visuals in your lectures? And he said, if you're a good storyteller, you don't need visuals.
You don't need the visuals, right, yeah. If you're a good storyteller, you don't need the visuals in your lectures. Yeah. Let's move on. I'm aware of time, and I think that just a couple things. It turns out when we're listening to a story, they've done scans of the brain. It turns out it looks sort of like a Christmas tree. Everything's lit up. Everything's lit up in the brain when we're listening to a story, as well as the language areas. If someone's just giving you a lecture and didactic information, it just turns out the language centers are engaged. So if you want to, it's okay. So if you want to engage people, tell stories, all right? If you go in and just give a strict lecture, people's brains are going to go somewhere else.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned it before, but how do you deal with story hijackers?
Story hijackers? I usually carry a gun and I shoot them. Yeah, that usually anyone else who is tempted to hijack a story, they back off. No, that's another question. Yeah. So one of the challenges I think is when people are who are not listening, is sometimes I'll say, "Give me a second, I haven't finished." Can you give me a second? I haven't finished. Because some people are just automatic. They're unconscious. They're not being aware. But yeah. It turns out that stories we have about ourselves. Yeah, one more.
So, question inspired by the phone making a noise a minute ago. So much talk nowadays about people's attention spans being shorter now because of social media, because of phones. But you're saying people still appreciate stories just as much as in the past. Like, how do you think those two sort of interact?
Yeah, it seems to become like, oh yeah, kids won't listen. They've got 10 seconds attention span. I will tell you, if you go in and you start telling a story, next thing you know, kids are going to be attending. Okay? Yeah. If you're telling a good story, kids will be attending. If you're a teacher, for example. So yes, attention span. Someone say that that the people who are big screen users, they have an attention span of about 8 seconds. Whereas goldfish have an attention span of 9 seconds. I don't know. So, yeah, one more and then.
If you tell a story of something you experienced with someone, your recollection of it, does that, and you'd like it to be healing, as opposed to reinforcing the bad image of it. I don't know
Well, now we're moving into a whole other territory about healing stories and how to use stories for healing. The truth is, when you share a story, one, you have to choose the right story. So I'll tell this. I'll answer this with a story, because that's the only way I know how to answer it. One day, a king he's looking for archers, the best archers in the land, and he rides into a village, and there on the side of the barn, are 3 bullseyes with arrows dead in the center of each one. He says, "Bring me the man who shot these arrows. I want him in my legions." So word goes out, and after a few minutes, they bring this young boy who's about 9 years old forward and said, "I did it." He said, "You shot these arrows?" He said, "Yes." I said, How did you learn to become such a good archer?" He said, "Well, first, I shot the arrows into the barn, and then I painted the circles around them." So sometimes we don't know whether a story's going to hit the target or not, right? Because if you're talking to a large group of people, you don't know if it's the right story. But people will take from the story what connects to them. And if it is the right story, it'll go right to their heart. But give me afterwards. That's a bigger conversation. So this last piece is that it turns out there's a saying that neurons that fire together wire together. Once we have a story about ourselves or the world, it's not like it's just we have a story. It gets wired into our brain. And that's why people come to therapists, because they're living inside of an old story, and they're stuck in that story, and they can't get out of the story. The therapist is not in that story. They're sitting outside the story. They can see it's just a story that they've been telling themselves for 30 years. I'm not good enough. I can't do that, or whatever it is. And part of the therapist's job is to help them reframe an earlier hurt, an earlier experience. The rabbi was talking about these kind of early hurts that kind of get wired in. This is the process. And then we start to see everything through that story. So part of the healing process is, one, saying, oh, maybe is that story necessarily true any longer? Is that story serving me any longer? Maybe it's time to tell a different story. Can you change the story? You brought that up. And you can, and it requires some work because it's uncomfortable. This is like an old suit of clothes that we love putting on every morning. It's really, even it's stained and it's got tears in it, but it's really a comfortable jacket. And your wife keeps on saying, God, could you get rid of that jacket? It's just disgusting. But I love this jacket. It's just, because it's comfortable. So trying on a new story requires some work. It requires telling a new story to transform yourself. There's a thing called narrative therapy. There's a guy named White out of, I think, New Zealand. And he said the things that make our lives difficult are not the wounds that we experienced in childhood. It's the story we keep telling about the wounding. And then that gets us stuck. So that's another topic. So we have one last thing that I want to do before the morning out. What time is it now? 11:20. We have 10 minutes? Can we go like an extra 10 minutes over? Would you guys be all right with that? Okay. So we have one last exercise here. And you will see on your table there's a thing called Angels and Heroes. And this is a tool for discovering your values. So one of the things we talk about with L'Ador Vador is how do we pass on our legacy and our values and the things that are important to us. Anybody need one? Raise your hand, and Terry will get you one. Okay. So this has got a two-part exercise. We'll take about 5 or 6 minutes to identify. What I'd like you to do is in each 7-year increment, I think this sheet goes up to 56. So take the first 7 increments, just to make, for our exercise today, you can complete this later, up to age 35. I want you to identify someone who was a hero for you, or an angel in your life. So for me, it was my great Aunt Faye when I was a kid. She was my grandmother Momo's sister. She came to live in Tampa, Florida, and she was unlike Momo. She was fun-loving. She was a great person to be around. She had a great sense of humor. She would take me to double feature movies on Saturday. She was the best. And so if I think about the things that were qualities that she expressed, she was interested in me and what I thought. She had a sense of humor, and she was fun-loving. Then I went to my philosophy professor in college, Charles Scott. Charles' door was always open. He was interested in what I thought. He was curious about the world of ideas. He was thoughtful. He was a great listener. And then I went off to study painting for a while in my life. And one of my favorite artists was Alexander Calder. And you've seen the mobiles. They're all painted mostly in primary colors, you know. And I went to the Guggenheim Museum, and there was a movie of him. He had created these characters, these circus characters, and he would invite people to his apartment in Paris and act out all these things and with all these characters. And I thought, that's the kind of person I'd like to be, you know? He was playful and artistic and imaginative. He took risks. He was fun-loving, and he loved color. Okay? So what I want you to do is this first part of the exercise, I want you to take a couple minutes, just do the first maybe 4 segments, right up maybe to like age 28, just as an experiment. And we'll come back and just identify who the person was and then what were the characteristics of things about them. And it could be a completely fictional character. I had someone put Dr. Spock. Okay? Dr. Spock was somebody he admired because of the way he approached problems and difficulties, was sort of always with clarity and never got too emotional about things. And it could be a biblical character. It could be King David or Moses or Abraham. Okay? Take about 5 minutes or so to do that. Up to age 35. If you can't think of somebody in a particular time segment, skip it and move on. Don't get caught up. And if you want to use a parent, you can use them once. Don't go and say, yeah, my dad. Okay? Or my mom. So you can use them once. I'll give you that as a requirement. Okay, let's pause for a second, just in the interest of time. This is, if I was doing it, we could take another hour with this. So we have 10 minutes. There's a brisk coming in here in a few minutes, so we'll just stay where you are. Just don't mind those people and what's going on around you. So, it's a tip-off, that's right, yeah. Ooh, yeah, you get the award for the worst joke of the morning. Okay, yeah. So, what's interesting about this, I think, is the people that you admire and the things that you admire in them are truly the things that you value in your life. So when I look at this list of Aunt Faye, Charles Scott, and Alexander Calder, I would say that these are my values. Not all of them necessarily, but a good many of them are things that you wouldn't have identified those people if there wasn't something you valued in their life and the way they related to you or what they represented. So there's a kind of there's different kinds of reminiscence in the taxonomy of reminiscence, and one is called transmissive reminiscence. It's sort of what you think it sounds like, to transmit. And what do we do in our Jewish culture? Is we're transmitting our values from generation to generation, right? We're passing on our values, and so much of our liturgy and so much of our cultural practices are built and integrated to do that. So how do you personally pass on your values to your children and your grandchildren and those you love? Well, I think one is through your stories. And two is, you're all familiar with ethical wills? I'm sure this is a very educated community. You know, what is an ethical will? It's you're passing on things that are important to you, not of material value, but of value in terms of your heart and your life. So your stories And so what you have here, you see there's a second sheet, which is you can start listing your values. So this is your homework. I'll be checking in on each of you over the next week. So complete the form and maybe go further up, and then take all those qualities that you identified of people that you identified as angels and heroes and say, which of these are the key values I have? And transpose those on. And so now you suddenly have, here's the things that I value in my life. Then you can say, if I was going to write an ethical will to my grandchild, George, what would I want to convey to him? And so, these 3 values I think would be really useful, what I know about him. And now you may have some stories to connect with the values. Say, George, I really value patience. And let me tell you about my grandfather and how he taught me patience. And you can share a story in your ethical will just for George that's very targeted to who he is. And it's connected to who you are. This is the way we pass on our values, is through our stories. So I think we've got about 5 minutes. I'm going to stop here and see what last questions you have, and then we'll call it a wrap and give people time to reset the room for the bris. Any last questions? Burning. Yeah, so let's get the mic and see if we can. It's green, so it's working.
It's actually not a question, it's a comment. I heard an interview yesterday with Tony Kushner, who wrote the screenplay for the new Spielberg movie. And he said he went to, and I don't know if any of you have seen it, I haven't seen it yet, but he said to Spielberg, tell me a story about the first movie that you've ever seen. And he told the story, I think it was a movie about a circus or something, but in that movie, there was this train crash. And apparently Spielberg then took that story and made this train crash a visual in the movie. And so the power of that story, instead of just saying, tell me the story of your life, I'm going to write a biopic about you, he used that visual, and I thought that was a remarkable experience of storytelling.
Yeah, how beautiful that is. Thank you. Any others? Yes, Stevie.
So, Rick, I think people are very excited about what you've been talking about and what they've seen. Any ideas or just tips for what people can do this week, next week, to kind of stay in this, do things with their kids for themselves? Thanksgiving is coming up. There's a great opportunity.
There's a great opportunity, yeah. So, I found sometimes if you do something, try to do something formal at Thanksgiving, it's too difficult. There's too many moving pieces that get people all around. But at the Thanksgiving table, something that we do often is, we do a little thing, say, what are we thankful for? And we'll go around the table, and that's an opportunity for sharing stories. And one of the things I'm doing this Thanksgiving is I recently went through a box. I had this giant box of photos that has never been sorted or put in catalogs or anything, and I was looking for a picture of my mother, and I thought, well, gosh, I'm going to do something with this. And I spent like a number of days, and I had the dining room table covered, and I sorted them all. I at least got them into envelopes and said, okay, these are for my nephew, and these are for my brother, and these are for my sister. And I'm bringing pictures to Thanksgiving. And I know we just had my nephew over and his mom not too long ago, and I had a picture of my nephew. He's maybe 3 or 4 years old, sitting in my lap, and I had hair down to my shoulders and a mustache, and it was a priceless picture. And we were so taken. He says, "Let's recreate it." And so we got on the couch, and he's a lot bigger now, and I had my arms around him, and we recreated the same expression and everything. So there's things you can do that can produce sharing and storytelling, and that's the way I would start looking at it. And if you have interest, begin finding places where you can tell the stories. And it's important, I think, to capture them in writing and those kinds of things, but I think it's much more important to tell them orally. Anyway, so I think we'll wrap it there.
We'll wrap it there. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
So when I opened this up, Rick sent it to us a while ago, and I opened it up, I said, I'm taking this to Thanksgiving.
because we're doing with another family that's have younger kids, and I don't really know how to talk to a 12-year-old these days. But if I ask questions, right? So I'm taking this to Thanksgiving, and I think that they'll hear really interesting stories from the older generation, et cetera. So a couple of thank yous to all the Brotherhood guys who came early and helped us set up. As you can tell, you heard there's a bris coming. Erin Mosley, our executive director, had a baby boy. Bris is in this room at 1 o'clock, so I'm going to ask everybody to help clear their spaces. If you want to buy Rick's book, I'll be over there. It's $20. And if you want to take anything home, please take things home. Then we have less to clear. And thank you for coming this morning, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving.